Latest tariffs on steel and aluminum are unjustified. They're illegal. They're bad for American workers, bad for American industry, and of course for Canadian industry as well.
Officials in Sault Ste. Marie are reacting to U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to double steel tariffs to 50%.
If you're in the market for a dishwasher or a fridge, you'll soon be paying more, thanks to U.S. tariffs.
It started with a deadline. Then came the warning. On June 19, 2025, Canada didn't whisper. It threatened. Prime Minister Mark Carney gave Washington exactly 30 days to reach a deal or face new tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum by July 21st. No more delays, no more goodwill. It was a retaliatory line in the sand drawn not with emotion but with calculation. Just hours later, the Federal Reserve stood still. Interest rates were frozen at 4.25 to 4.50% despite rising pressure from global markets to cut. Why, in Powell's words, tariffs are a murky signal. Translation: even the Fed doesn't know where America's economy is heading because trade policy is now the biggest wild card. And in that same moment, two warnings echoed, one from Ottawa, one from the Fed. One economic, one geopolitical. Both unmistakable. The real storm hasn't started yet, but the pressure is building. Canada isn't just threatening, it's steering. Mark Carney's message wasn't some vague political jab. It came with a hard 30-day clock and a clearly implied escalation if the U.S. doesn't concede. Retaliatory tariffs on steel and aluminum could double from 25% to a punishing 50%. That's not a press release, that's leverage. And behind the scenes, Ottawa isn't winging it. The negotiation roadmap is laser-focused: first trade, then security, then economic autonomy. Canada is sequencing the talks to protect its own house first, making sure domestic producers, public procurement rules, and sovereign investment tools stay out of Washington's reach. That includes a strong preference for Canadian companies in infrastructure projects and carefully controlled quota expansions for sensitive imports. Carney's strategy is clear: don't beg for alignment, set the terms of engagement. While Washington scrambles to maintain old privileges, Ottawa is redrawing the blueprint. And for the first time in years, it's doing so from a position of strength.
We need to protect ourselves. That's part of the reason why, well, those are the reasons why we've started with the over-the-horizon radar scheme with the Arctic, which is one component of a broader protection that needs to be put in place.
Donald Trump once framed tariffs as a clean tactical fix. "I'm a tariff person. Simple, easy, precise," he said, portraying them as a kind of peaceful power play. Not a bomb, not a war, just taxes at the border. The logic was seductive: penalize rivals, protect American jobs, and restore leverage. But in 2025, that simplicity is collapsing under its own weight. And what's left behind is anything but precise. Take the U.S. steel and aluminum markets. Prices have soared since the new round of tariffs hit, pushing up the cost of everything from construction materials to kitchen appliances. Domestic producers, instead of ramping up smoothly, have struggled with labor shortages, delayed upgrades, and supply backlogs. And for importers, they're stuck. Many now face a 50% markup on critical inputs, making American-made goods more expensive, not more competitive. Then there's the Federal Reserve, caught in the crossfire. Just months ago, markets were betting on a rate cut. But by June 2025, Chair Jerome Powell hit pause again. The Fed left interest rates frozen at 4.25, 4.50%, not because inflation was rising, but because the inflation caused by tariffs remains unclear and unstable. Powell described the situation as murky, warning that tariff policy had become an unpredictable variable the central bank could no longer ignore. In other words, economic strategy is being shaped not by market logic, but by political brinkmanship. And for businesses, it's a nightmare of uncertainty. Reuters has called tariffs the wild card in America's post-pandemic economy, and not without reason. Companies can't plan sourcing. Pricing models are outdated by the time they're printed. Contracts are breaking. And no one, not even in Washington, can say with confidence which country will be the next target or which sector will get caught in the crossfire. What was sold as a simple tool has become a strategic liability. Instead of calming markets, tariffs have introduced volatility. Instead of protecting jobs, they've choked investment. And instead of making America stronger, they've put even its own allies like Canada on the defensive. Simplicity, it turns out, comes at a cost. And in 2025, that cost is being paid in dollars, jobs, and trust.
You pay the tariff. the American consumer, the American businesses. This is a tax on the American people, and this is a tax on American businesses.
Mark Carney doesn't govern by outbursts. He doesn't tweet threats at 2 a.m., nor does he stage dramatic press conferences filled with fiery slogans. His brand of leadership is quieter but sharper. And in 2025, that deliberate calm is turning into Canada's most potent weapon. When Donald Trump raised tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%, many expected a fiery response from Ottawa. Instead, Carney issued something far more unsettling for Washington, a 30-day countdown. If no deal was reached by July 21st, Canada would initiate a full counter-tariff package targeted, structured, and fully prepared. No emotion, just execution. But what makes Carney's move even more formidable is what followed behind the scenes. His government immediately assembled a market monitoring task force drawing data from trade routes, ports, and industrial players across the country. This wasn't a reactive gesture. It was the methodical rollout of a defensive strategy designed long before the first tariff hit. Unlike past Canadian administrations, Carney wasn't just hoping for diplomacy, he was preparing for escalation. And his message to the Canadian public wasn't about nationalism or scoring political points. It was human. Steel and aluminum workers are on the front lines of this crisis, he said in a national address. Not CEOs, not trade lawyers, workers.
What are Canada's goals during these 30-day talks?
Well, I mean, the high level is the best goal, the best result for Canadian workers and businesses, first thing. Secondly, for that to be the case, we need to stabilize the trading relationship with the United States. We need to have ready access to U.S. markets for Canadian companies and for Canadian companies, and not have our hands tied in terms of our dealings with the rest of the world.
By putting everyday Canadians at the center of the narrative, Carney reframed the tariff war from an abstract economic debate to a direct attack on jobs, communities, and family livelihoods. He didn't paint the U.S. as an enemy, he simply asked, who's really paying the price? While Washington falls into cycles of trade brinkmanship and political showdowns, Ottawa under Carney is playing a longer game. He's not trying to shock the system, he's stabilizing Canada's position within it. His actions send a clear message to allies and competitors alike. Canada doesn't need to roar to retaliate. It just needs to move deliberately and decisively. And that might be Carney's greatest advantage. While others chase headlines, he builds leverage. While others escalate rhetorically, he escalates structurally. He doesn't need to dominate the news cycle to win the trade war. He just needs to outlast it. At the 2025 G7 summit, the contrast between Donald Trump and Mark Carney couldn't have been sharper, and the world noticed. Trump arrived with his usual bravado, issuing sharp one-liners and sweeping threats. He called tariffs a tool of peace, dismissed criticism as weakness, and promised more trade victories through what he described as simple, powerful moves. It was classic Trump, loud, direct, and headline-hungry. Carney, on the other hand, said less, but did more. While Trump offered slogans, Carney laid out outcomes. While Trump threatened retaliation, Carney provided deadlines, enforcement mechanism, and a transparent policy framework. And he did it all without raising his voice. What followed wasn't just diplomatic nuance, it was a lesson in leadership. International press outlets from The Guardian to Der Spiegel praised Carney's style as quietly strategic. G7 leaders echoed that sentiment behind closed doors. Several described Canada's approach as a model for modern crisis management firm, clear and grounded in facts rather than flair. What made this even more striking was the ripple effect. European leaders, long caught between Trump's unpredictability and their own economic constraints, gravitated toward Carney's pragmatism. Japanese and German officials reportedly sought bilateral sideline meetings with him to discuss coordination beyond the U.S. framework. In a summit built on tension, Carney didn't need to dominate the stage. He just needed to offer something the others weren't: stability. And in a world increasingly defined by noise, that calm competence is becoming the most valuable currency of all. The fallout was as predictable as it was avoidable, and the split between Canada and the U.S. couldn't be clearer. On Canada's side, the results speak for themselves. By acting early, communicating clearly, and preparing countermeasures without drama, Ottawa managed to protect its core industries. Steel and aluminum production remained steady. Export routes through Vancouver, Halifax, and Montreal stayed open and efficient. Domestic infrastructure projects moved forward without cost spikes, giving Canadian firms a vital edge in both public tenders and international supply contracts. In short, Canada didn't just hold its ground, it turned the pressure into leverage. Meanwhile, in the US, the opposite story unfolded. Trump's blanket tariffs pushed import prices higher, especially for raw materials like steel and aluminum that are essential to everything from canned goods to cars. That ripple effect hit manufacturers first and consumers soon after. By mid-2025, inflation wasn't just lingering, it was reinflating. The Federal Reserve had no choice. Despite signs of slowing growth, it refused to cut interest rates, citing ongoing uncertainty from tariff-driven cost pressures. In other words, trade policy had cornered monetary policy. The price of political brinkmanship. Higher mortgage rates, more expensive credit for small businesses, and tighter household budgets heading into the year's final quarter. So while Canada maintained access, trust, and momentum, the US was left with rising costs, stalled rate relief, and a nervous business sector. The irony is hard to miss in trying to punish others. Washington punished itself. It began with strength, or at least the illusion of it. Tariffs, Trump said, were simple, powerful, and precise. He wielded them like a weapon, convinced they would bend allies and adversaries alike. For a moment, it seemed to work. The US economy surged in early forecasts. The White House called it economic leverage in action. But beneath that surface, a knot was tightening. Instead of compliance, Trump's tariffs triggered countermeasures. Instead of leadership, the US found itself isolated. And by 2025, the very tools meant to protect American industry had become its biggest liabilities, fueling inflation, freezing interest rate cuts, and rattling supply chains from Texas to Taiwan. Then came the reversal. Mark Carney didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He set a 30-day deadline, stayed quiet, and waited. And while Washington spun in headlines, Ottawa negotiated in silence. Carney's approach wasn't simple, but it was strategic. With no need for escalation, Canada suddenly found itself in control-stable markets, rising exports, and growing international confidence. Now the clock is ticking again. If the US doesn't respond by July 21st, Canada is poised to escalate with targeted tariffs, preferential procurement clauses, and retaliatory infrastructure policies already on the table. Trump's simple tariff playbook is being replaced by a more complex but far more effective model of economic statecraft. So the question isn't just what Washington will do, it's whether it even understands what's happening. What do you think? Is the US still driving the trade agenda, or has it quietly lost control? Drop your take in the comments, because the next 30 days could decide the next 30 years.